Welcome to the SMT Forum. My name is Jim Hewitt. I'm an associate professor here at OISE and technology instructor. I'm delighted to be here today. These SMT Forums, they're always a highlight in the SMT department because we get to talk about a number of pressing issues in science, mathematics, or technology. I think this is about the sixth one we've done over the last couple of years. And this one's entitled The STEM Movement, Golden Opportunity or Trojan Horse. And STEM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics. We have with us today a distinguished panel of speakers. First, we have the director of the SMT, John Wallace, professor here and science researcher. All the way from the University of British Columbia, we've got Samson Nashon, who's here. Welcome, and it's great to have you back.
Thank you.
Anna Marie Navas, you the student?
Yes.
Student, right? We have guest Jason Foster from U of T Engineering Science. Welcome. And then Larry Benz, who's a professor in science education, also from OISE. So it's wonderful to have you all here today. The issue circles around the STEM movement and its implications for education. So one of the concerns is that the increasing emphasis on STEM education has been spurred primarily by an economic agenda. In other words, in order to get more graduates in science education fields for the job market, governments are being pushed to really try to recruit science, engineering, and technology students. And so you can look at this a number of ways. On one hand, you might see this as terrific. It means we get to do more work now in those fields, and we get to look at science, engineering, and technology more deeply, mathematics. Others see this movement as more like a Trojan horse. It looks good on the outside, but it's focused mainly on skills training to feed into the capitalist enterprise. So this is the issue we're going to talk about tonight. So each of the speakers is going to have 5 minutes to talk about this issue. And I'm going to just, once we get close to maybe a minute left, I'll just raise this little card just so you know. We'll do one round, and then after that we're going to do another quick little round where people can talk about each other's thoughts and ideas and respond to them. And then after that, we've got some microphones here, and we hope you'll come up and ask some questions for the panelists to answer. Okay, great, so let's go. And John, can you start us off?
Yes, hi everyone. This STEM thing is an interesting beast, really. It's an interesting, rather unwieldy, and difficult to unravel beast. Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Interesting bedfellows, I would say. I'm the editor of a journal which has science, mathematics, and technology education in the title. And one of the challenges for me as editor is to find ways that these communities talk to one another. They're kind of like cousins. Sometimes distant cousins, sometimes close cousins. The disciplines, and engineering has been added to this mix. Sometimes these disciplines talk to one another, and other times not. It seems to me that they have, in many respects, different histories, speak to different communities, and in some respects have different epistemological underpinnings. So given that background, one wonders what they're doing together. That's one of the interesting puzzles for me is why lump these four subjects together. Another way of thinking about STEM is in terms of, for me at least, it's in terms of ends and means. If we think about STEM education, if we think about the ends of STEM education, there are different ways of looking at it. And the two ways that that are most talked about is the first way is that what we are most interested in doing is producing high quality graduates in the fields of STEM, and we should be teaching more content and more of what we would call the traditions, the traditional science, mathematics, and technology subjects. So that's the first kind of vision, if you like, for STEM education. The second vision is about literacy, about trying to attract more people in, trying to educate people for citizenship, trying to prepare them for the world, and that's I guess the second vision. These are two quite different visions, and some people would even say that they're irreconcilable differences. My own view is that they're not irreconcilable. I'm an advocate of what you might call a both and approach. We need both the first vision and the second vision. We need more people trained in the sciences to conduct the scientific and technological enterprise. But we also need to teach people to become more literate in the science-related fields. So that's the question of ends. And I think before one talks about means, one needs to understand what ends one is, what the ends of the enterprise might be. In terms of means, there are different ways of looking at means, and it kind of depends on what ends you're looking at. My own interest in terms of means is in more integrated approaches to teaching science, technology, and mathematics and engineering. And so I've been doing some research, which I can talk about later, in terms of, mainly in schools, about how we can bring these subjects together in both transdisciplinary teaching, interdisciplinary teaching, cross-disciplinary teaching. And perhaps later, as we are having our discussions, I can talk more about that.
Okay, thank you, John.
Thank you. I must thank the Center for inviting UBC to participate in this forum. And mine is the view I'll present. It's one from the UBC group as well as my own. When I think about STEM, I've tried to separate from STEM as a way of understanding the world around us from who has sponsored STEM-related activities. Because sponsors have their own interests, and they may capitalize on a good cause to achieve their ends. So I'll look at what STEM is. I have seen STEM as comprising labels of disciplines whose content is not mutually exclusive. In this case, what I'm trying to say is, if I think of my thinking and what I do, you may find, if you get to my mind, it will be very difficult to separate scientific thinking, technological thinking, engineering thinking, and the mathematical thinking. So I tend to see STEM as addressing three questions: how, why, and the what. And this is a natural way of us actually thinking about what is happening around us. The how question, in my own life, I've always looked at it this way. And I want you to imagine a deep and wide river. I have to go around. Swimming, I could drown, or it could be a habitation of animals or creatures that would never spare me. So the question is, how do I cross this river without getting my feet wet? Now, if you think of that question, it would be very interesting if one can tell me you start with a science or a technology or engineering or mathematics to answer it. It will be all those together operating. Whether you start with the technology, whether it is the engineer, but you'll find that in the mind, those disciplines are interacting. So in that way, I see it as a way of thinking about dealing with problems, unique problems that require that kind of thinking. So in this way, I see the world as having many problems. Different kinds of problems require different kinds of solutions and different ways of thinking about them. So STEM, to me, is a way of thinking. How it's funded to promote its activities depends on who is funding, but it is the role of the researcher, the role of the STEM person to come up with what is appropriate for human life, whether it's environmental, whether it is for other uses. Because I have heard in the past people say, because of STEM, environment is left out. Well, STEM is a way of dealing with the environmental challenges. Think of the question, how? If you answer the how, then it will be the why. And if you answer the why, then what made it happen? And therefore, in conclusion, I see them as which one came first, the egg or the chicken. Thank you.
Well, first I would like to thank John for inviting me to participate in this forum and for thinking that the topics I have been researching make sense for this discussion about STEM education. So I'm in the second year of the PhD here at OISE in the CTL department, working with Herminia Pedretti around topics such as science communication, critical scientific literacy, and science museums. And before coming to Toronto, I was in São Paulo, Brazil, the place where I did my master's and where I worked for almost 8 years with science museums and the educational activities they developed. So related to this research and professional interests, I would like to start with a question. Where can engagement with the STEM subjects occur? And I'm asking that because I was reviewing the proceedings of the STEM education conference that took place in British Columbia this year. And it was interesting to notice that just a few presentations were dedicated to the informal sector. And by informal, I mean settings such as museums, science centers, radio, TV. If I can recall correctly, just 10 or 11 presentations were dedicated to the informal sector. And even though there is a major trend in the STEM movement related to this integrated approach of curriculum, which implies an obvious focus on the formal sector, I believe that the informal sector represents a space where engagement with the STEM issues can occur. And I'm referring here to a major goal that can be attributed to STEM education, which is increasing critical scientific literacy. So, but what kind of engagement with the STEM issues are we talking about when we think about the informal sector? for decades, a prevalent way of thinking about communication in those settings has been the deficit model of communication, which means trying to fill in a gap of knowledge or a deficit of knowledge that separates scientists from non-scientists. And the aspiration behind is that by increasing this knowledge, it will be possible to create a more welcoming climate for scientific and technological development. And this is a major concern for some Western developed countries. So we can think about an example of this deficit model in more traditional science exhibits that tend to represent extended narratives around theories, ideas, facts, narratives that are not questioned, just offered as a reality, as facts for passive audiences. So in this context, I would like to move your attention towards different ways in which I believe that engagement with the STEM issues can occur. I'm referring to more iterative models of science communication that have embraced dynamics such as negotiation, consultation, participation, and knowledge co-production. And one example is, well, I visited last December an exhibit in São Paulo, Brazil, called Preventing Youth Pregnancy, and I think it is a good example of how it can work. In this exhibit, visitors were invited first to participate in a very informal meeting in couch and share, young visitors and teenagers, and share their personal plans for life, their plans for the future. After this meeting, they were invited to visit the exhibit that approached sexuality in a very frank manner. They were invited to make decisions about the issues raised, and unexpected scenarios can appear. For example, unexpected pregnancies that need to be represented through a balloon under the t-shirt. So after visiting the exhibit, visitors are invited to participate in this forum again and revisiting their personal plans for life. So I believe that this kind of initiative, first of all, these initiatives are the main focus of the research I'm doing right now, and I believe that they represent critical approaches of scientific literacy. I think that they represent opportunities for look at an integrated ways and holistic ways of thinking about STEM subjects. They tend to create spaces where visitors can be heard and can be considered agents of transformation. So I see here also a call for humanism. And I believe that they represent opportunities for sharing different positions and point of view. Finally, I would like to approach one last question. Who is being engaged with the STEM issues and why? And I would like to contextualize this question in the South American context, and particularly in the Brazilian case, which is the one I know pretty well. So international comparative studies and national surveys have shown that Brazilian citizens have an increasing interest in scientific and technological careers, in scientific topics, and they have positive attitudes towards scientists. So if there is already a welcoming climate for scientific and technological development, what are the goals of engaging the population with the STEM issues? Well, the Brazilian government created an interesting link between social inclusion and informal science education, and there is a governmental agency, a Department of Science Communication within the Ministry of Science and Technology. So researchers working in informal sector need to answer this call of social inclusion. And the government has been very clear about the need of overcoming deficit perspective and move towards participatory and dialogic models of science communication, specifically this idea of knowledge co-production with marginalized communities, such as youth and women in low-income families. So we can see here again an opportunity to link through the informal sector the engagement with the STEM issues with this notion of giving tools to individuals for transforming society. Thanks.
So as my previous two colleagues have done, I'd like to thank the Center for inviting me here in particular. So I actually got north of Harvard for the first time in a long time as someone who tends to play near college. So I am of the engineering faculty. I teach engineering design. My research area, however, is not in engineering education. So I've approached this very much as a practitioner of engineering education, which is therefore embedded within some of STEM. Neither do I have a child currently in primary or secondary education. So a lot of my understanding of STEM comes from the students who have been admitted into engineering. And so it's interesting to see their experiences of STEM education as those that brought them to see me. But in terms of definition in terms, my students ask, what is the difference between science and engineering and between technology and design? I've had no choice but to try to give them effectively single-word answers. So where I've ended up going is that science is where you learn to model. Technology is where you learn to make. Engineering is where you learn to design. And mathematics is the language you use in those disciplines. And that at least keeps the students happy enough that they actually pay attention in the rest of class. But with that in mind, it's really fascinating to look at how one enters into engineering education at the university level, and the technology and engineering doesn't exist. We give credit for science credits and for high school mathematics. We don't actually ask for technology or engineering. So from the point of view of university, there's S, M, and somewhat of a lack of T and E at the high school level. Many of my students have that experience. So although we're part of the STEM enterprise, we only admit a subset. And that then has ripple effects on the curriculum that we can offer and the way we approach engineering education, in that we are attracting students who really believe in science and really believe in mathematics. And then we try to convince them that in fact there's more to engineering than science and mathematics. There's technology and engineering. So it's a really interesting challenge for us right at the beginning. And one of the ways that we do this is we first challenge our students to actually start to see the world and to actually look around the built world that they inhabit from the points of view of science and mathematics. They have lots of experience with the content of science and the content of mathematics. They've rarely been asked, can you use that to adjust your perspective on the world, to augment the perspective you got in your world issues class, your English class, and other classes? And that starts to open up what STEM might be. But then they start to question, well, hold on, if we're doing this, are we applied science or are we engineering? And that gets really interesting when you look at the faculty. It's the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering, but somehow we're supposed to distinguish the two. And what we start to move towards is the idea that in addition to the worldviews and the epistemologies, there's this notion that engineering can't just be applied science. It involves judgment and ambiguity and interaction and dialogue and hermeneutics, and the students immediately start to panic. Because nowhere in their understanding of what it means to be a scientific individual or a critical, rational individual is exercising judgment. And so we start to work with them to start to develop the self. So I need to say this is in the first year design courses, in those, right? There's also the other part of engineering, all my colleagues who are saying, no, they need to know the second law of thermodynamics and they need to know it cold. And so even within the E of STEM, there's a huge, and some people call it a pendulum, there's been a huge evolution and a huge set of questions about how much is this training for industry and skills and facts, and how much is it the creation of individuals who have an engineering identity, a professionalism, the ability to exercise judgment. And that pendulum is busy teetering back and forth, and I think right now where design really got a lot of push, and who knows where it's going to go. But even within the E of STEM there as well, are you an S-style E or an M-style E, and it all gets kind of messy. I asked the students, say, why am I here? Or we ask them why they're here, and they say, I love science, I love mathematics, I want to get a job. Which unfortunately means I'm looking very much like a Trojan horse right now. But then they also say, but I can use this to change the world for the better, whether it's through Engineers Without Borders, whether it's through entrepreneurship, which admittedly has an economic realm, or whether it's just that ability to engage with the technological society around them. That's what engineering to them offers. And the science and the math and technology are tools around that. So that's how things are starting to play down the street at college.
I guess I'm the devil's advocate here. No, I want to start off by saying that the STEM education idea is an important one. I fully support the integration of those four fields. I think it makes perfect sense because in reality, they do work together, those fields. You rarely see, in my view, you rarely see scientists not doing some sort of form of engineering, and I could go on and on. A lot of technological innovations depend on science, and the same person may be doing both and so on. But there isn't time to go into that at length, but I'm a supporter of the integration component of this. I think the shift in the STEM education thing I detect as a science education movement. And so what it's doing is bringing in engineering and to science along with mathematics, but it seems to be about generating useful products for our societies. And I think there's a lot of merit in that. There's no question that STEM fields have created incredible products and services that have changed people's lives for the better. I'm one of them, had a heart attack last year, and I wouldn't be alive without medical engineering and technology and so on. In Sao Paulo. Well, it was the operation wasn't in Sao Paulo, but I recovered there. And of course, in the STEM education movement, I'm not sure if you know, there have been a number of movements such as bringing more females into the field, people of color, other disadvantaged groups in a sense. So there are some very positive things that are happening in STEM. And I was actually just looking at Jason's students' work, and they do a lot of wonderful design things around more efficient ways to get people to move around and more sustainable ways of doing things and so on. So there's no question there's some fabulous things in STEM education. However, excuse me there, so I am the one, I believe that the STEM education movement is largely, and I'm talking about the education movement, not STEM fields primarily, but STEM education behaves like a Trojan horse. And in fact, I want to go one step further and say it seems to be an example of what Naomi Klein talks about in terms of disaster capitalism. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with her book, The Shock Doctrine and the concept of disaster capitalism, but the idea is that we'll either create a disaster or we'll take advantage of disasters. So it's in her book, it's well known that people from the right and financial sectors took huge advantage of the terrible things that happened in New Orleans after that huge flood and disaster that happened there. But what they've done here is they've created a disaster in the sense of an apparent need for more STEM workers. And actually, a colleague of mine and friend, I think he coined this, but it's Clayton Pierce, has coined the expression a neo-Sputnik kind of crisis. So reminiscent of the Sputnik crisis of the 50s, there's this sense that we're in such a crisis because China and India are going to get ahead of us. In fact, it is apparent that they've caught up and probably are going ahead in terms of the number of Fortune 2000 companies in the world. So there's this huge concern that there's going to be losses in international competitiveness. And so therefore, we need to push for more STEM education. Huge amounts of money are being spent on this. In fact, in the US, they have taken away from the liberal arts and the humanities a lot of funding. So it's a huge movement right now. It's a, wow. How much time is it? One. Oh my God. I'll never get through all of this. So I think it's treated as a huge crisis, and STEM is said to be a savior of humanity. I want to say that, in fact, I think that it isn't an international competition. It's a competition between companies, because companies, the real power now is between financiers and companies that are detached from nation states. And you only have to look at the international trade agreements that dominate our world. The World Bank, the World Trade Organization, huge numbers of organizations like this. Their prime motivation is to make profit for a very small fraction of the population. Look at Francis Piketty's book, Capitalism in the 21st Century. We're now headed towards massive concentration of wealth into extremely small numbers of hands, at the expense of the well-being of individual societies and environments. In other words, I brought along, I'm right to my end here. I'm recommending you read Naomi Klein's latest book, essentially This Changes Everything, the subtitle being Capitalism versus the Climate. So I think the STEM movement is essentially an effort to select out future STEM workers who can primarily create products and services that will make a few people rich and do huge harm to many individuals, massive poverty, a lot of dependence, societal dependence, through advertising. I can go on at length with this, and I don't have time. And environmental destruction, and of course the big one is climate change. We're risking humanity's presence and a lot of other living things on this planet because of this, and no one's doing anything about it, and it's largely linked to capitalism. So the STEM movement the conclusion is, I'm in favor of STEM education, but the STEM education needs to take into account all of these social, political, economic, social justice, and so on, aspects to it, to become, to save our planet, essentially, and save our people, and save other living things on the planet. So, sorry for that.
Good, thank you. Terrific presentations. I'd like to invite the panel now to, maybe we can just do this free form if you have any things that you'd like to say about someone else's presentation and make a comment on it or ask for a question or a clarification.
Since the mic ended up in my hand. One element I would just, not necessarily rebut, but to look at is the notion of making.
Yeah.
And the idea that in fact, as STEM is evolving, it's towards enabling agency in the face of the technologies around us, to enable people to make them their own, to customize, to repurpose, to rebuild. And that sense that I am not beholden to existing industries, existing products. I instead, by virtue of STEM, which I'm giving a lot of credit to, I can now choose how to engage with the technology and not to, and so on. So I think, yes, from one perspective, the number of workers and foreign visas and that kind of thing, the lotteries in the US, the H-1Bs, there is that shock doctrine element to it of we need more. But by the same token, by enabling a larger swath of the population to see that they are not subject to technology, but are in fact able to work with, engage, and change it, I think personally that benefit outweighs the potential risk of the earlier part.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm a fan of the maker culture. I commented on this before and done some work with this, and so I am a fan. I think that's an important thing. A critical aspect of this is that when you, in a sense, you could be construed as an individualistic orientation, which is part of the neoliberal plan to make everyone be an entrepreneur. Having said that, I think that this whole idea of promoting more engineering is a good thing, but I don't think it's happening. I think the reality is, if you look at, and we've done this actually, one of the students working with me, Darren Hoig, has done an analysis, discourse analysis of the national standards in the US, and we continually find that they've raised the bar so that fewer and fewer people can actually be admitted to the fields of engineering and science. So as you know, science and math, as you said, are used as gatekeeper subjects to determine who will get into the engineering, but ironically, they're not trained or whatever in engineering and actually in decision making, especially ethical decision making. So I think that, as I said before, our society is terribly oriented towards reducing the number of people who are well off to a very small number. And in fact, there's this other phenomena called technological unemployment, and it's essentially another way of talking about the old, what's the term? Well, it's just essentially, as we develop more engineering products, more and more people are going to be put out of work. And so there's a study that suggests that up to 47% of the existing jobs today will be gone in 20 years because of technological unemployment. And so it's a wonderful idea to get more people to do their own kind of maker culture and engineering and so on, but the system is not set up to do that. The system, I think, is set up to select out the few people who can serve as knowledge generators, who can control the masses. And we've got to talk about biopolitics and Foucault's ideas around that. Thank you. Sorry.
I'm always interested to hear your ideas, Larry. what I guess one of the things that concerns me about this critique is that on the one hand, we're acknowledging the power of science and the power of mathematics and the power of engineering and technology. On the one hand, we've got many examples of people working in that field on the panel here. But on the other hand, you're saying that it's a force for something. There's a force for evil out there. There's a force for doing bad things. But science itself, technology itself, engineering and mathematics are not intrinsically bad. They're not intrinsically bad.
I never said that.
So what is intrinsically bad? If STEM is okay, what's intrinsically bad?
Okay. Well, you want to meet in the pub after? No. Well, again, I think it follows from what I've been saying that, first of all, I don't believe that science and technology or any discipline whatsoever are isolated entities. They're part of networks. I'm an actor network fan. So the problems that we have in the way science and technology are used have to do with banks, international trade organizations, but if you analyze it down, what's that? If you reduce it, what is it? It's power. It's a phenomenon of power that's distributed across networks, and it's built into. It seems to be built into humanity. I haven't analyzed why it is, but you only have to look at the bottom line. We're losing species every day. We're losing land masses every day. We have massive problems of climate change. It's the way science and technology are used by people in power. That's the problem. The problem is not science and technology.
Sometimes these debates become very interesting. I wouldn't like this to be Larry versus us, but he's raising very critical questions. But also, I have a question that Larry could answer or some other people could respond to. My colleague Larry has mentioned climate change, environmental disasters, and he seems indirectly to be attributing that to STEM. If you remember my earlier premise that STEM, in my view, attempts to address questions that have to do with what is happening around us. I believe that's how we can address the climate change or climate disaster or things that are due to climate change, be it disasters, could be the floods. Why did what happened in New Orleans happen? Solutions or attempt to get solutions reside in STEM education. So maybe I need to be enlightened more on that.
I'll toss a cent or two in, and I think one of the arguments that I believe has been raised in both areas is the notion of externalized consequences, that the notion that you can externalize things. And science, as I was taught it, was a little too willing to leave things out of its models. And rather than teach students the notion of modeling, that science and by extension engineering and mathematics are about, it's the notion of I am crafting a model that should be taught versus here's this model and this model and this model. And in the sense that if science has stated this is the model that is in play and it has externalized certain factors that may have consequences, then I would perhaps even be willing to accept it. In that sense, science is bad. But that's an artifact of the particular scientific models that are selected, not the process thereof. And one of the things that, again, I can speak to my students who are busy doing this right now, they're trying to model a situation and we're asking them, what are you bringing in and who are you leaving out? And what are the power dynamics there? And is it ethical to not include this stakeholder versus that stakeholder? But when science is introduced as a set of models for you to apply on your world, and those models have well-known consequences, then I think there's some culpability in the STEM, I don't want to paint too broad a brush, but in the STEM education community for promulgating that viewpoint.
Did you want to come back?
Our friend Larry was on the agenda just recently, and it was a very interesting session on the agenda. I was glued to the screen. No, it was very good, very good. And one of apparently there's been a study, it's a study done of scientific literacy, tracking scientific literacy over the past 20 years or so, a study done in the US. I'm not sure what measures of scientific literacy they use.
Newspaper.
Oh, okay. And it turns out that Canada is doing pretty well. Over the last 20, 30 years, we've tracked from something like 20% up into the high 40s, 50%, and it's the highest in the developed world, Canada, right? So scientific literacy as measured by this particular scale is we're doing okay, but I wonder whether the thing that Larry is talking about is not scientific literacy at all, or it's actually something else. It's actually something like political literacy, or or capitalist literacy. No, it's not. It's you think it's.
Well, you want me to,
You go for it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the old definition of what scientific literacy means. If you're a believer in STSE education, which is the law in this province, and if you believe in socio-scientific issues education, which is practiced in many countries in the world, if you believe in what's used in, I happen to have a colleague in France, they have another thing they call socially acute questions. It's just another way of describing politics integrated with science and technology and members of society, issues of power and so on. If you ever think that a person walking into an engineering lab or a scientist, I did science, have a master's and did some science, walks into that door and forgets that they have a certain set of cultural values, a certain set of religious values, or a certain set of political values, you're vastly mistaken. Now, I also wanted to mention that, by all means, again, it's not processes of science and technology or STEM that are the problem. It's politics. And a good example, just that I happened to look up recently, and it seems to be on my mind a lot, is Roundup Ready canola beans, or seeds, I should say, as you know, have they've inserted this gene that allows for the seed itself to combat a particular pesticide. Well, that in turn is causing certain problems with sort of a natural selection of the actual pest that it's intended to confront. But also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, they have the terminator gene in that particular seed. So they've added a gene that will prevent that seed from reproducing. So the farmers have to buy more just from that one company, Monsanto. Now, this is just one example. I could go on and on at length. We have a lot of social, environmental, and political problems tied directly into science and technology. There isn't time to go into all the problems we have, but it's there. And to say that's scientific literacy, that's not scientific literacy. That's old school. We're now in a situation where you've got to realize we're networked. We're connected to everything. And right now we're connected to power in such a way that this planet is being destroyed, and there's a lot of people being destroyed on this planet. We've got to remember that. We live in luxury, but we have to look beyond our world and realize what desperate straits most of the world is in. And we're doing next to nothing about it. And again, read this book. Just to give you one of probably the biggest issues associated with it. So sorry to get so upset. But it's real. It's real.
Okay, so maybe as a next step, we should invite some people up to ask questions. I think this is a terrific discussion and very interesting issues. So please come up to the microphone, and maybe while we're doing that, I'll ask a question. I was really interested in all of your talks, and I was listening to what Jason was saying about how he teaches and the types of students he gets in. And then I started thinking about the Ontario curriculum, and I thought about how in elementary the number of science topics taught per year has gone down from 5 to 4. And we've brought in a bigger SDSE focus in high school science, and you talked about some of these initiatives. And in mathematics, you know, we used to learn integration in senior mathematics. They don't do that anymore. They now leave that for university. So I don't really see the Trojan horse. I don't see the tentacles of corporations shaping our school systems. I mean, it seems to me, if anything, it's going in the other direction.
You only have to look at the next generation science standards. I don't know if I need a microphone. I don't think you need. This technology, get rid of it. If you only have to look at the next generation science standards, and they've terribly minimized what used to be there in terms of nature of science and social scientific issues, which is what they use in the US. It's reduced to a tiny minimum. It's now highly focused towards learning highly prescribed products of science and technology, laws and theories, and the way engineering products work, and for skill development around those fields. It has really changed dramatically. And I think Canada is following this in those footsteps.
I'm going to take a slightly different tack, I think. I was fortunate to get to work with the Toronto District School Board last year and to present at their Eureka conference. And one of the things I did was sort of describe some of the challenges we see in mathematics in particular once students reach university and engineering. And of particular note was that students really hadn't been sensitized to the idea that there were better and worse ways of addressing mathematical challenges. And so I mentioned this, and afterwards some teachers came up and said, well, we'd love to do that. There's room in their curriculum for that. But the parents won't allow us, because the parents have decided in their own minds that there is a model of STEM and science and mathematics from their experience. And if I try to teach what is coming out of places like OISE and what you're suggesting we should teach, I will have parents going to my principal and saying, take this person out because they need a 97.6 or whatever the number is to get into engineering as they go forward. And anything, for example, asking my child to distinguish between two ways of doing an integration, two ways of differentiating, which is more usable, easier, all of those value judgments, all of it, where's the beauty? Show me which of these is the more beautiful solution. They are feeling, some of these folks, restricted from doing so because of views of science and STEM that go back 30, 40 years. And so it's challenging to say, is it STEM as now? Is it the STEM that we're doing, the EU that we're doing over down in the Bain Center, where we're asking our students to exercise judgment and values and talk to people directly as opposed to indirectly? Or are we actually dealing with issues that are 30, 40 years old, and the power of the parents in the teaching system and the schooling system is in play as well?
But I'm just gonna slightly change the subject because I have a question for Larry before. Larry, I was wondering if your reflections are considered within the Western developed countries, so how you consider, in your perspective, other socio-political contexts. You said that science and technology and the STEM issues cannot be separated for the socio-political context they are embedded, right? So I was wondering if your reflections, they emerge from the Western developed countries and are limited to the Western developed countries, and how you include perspectives from other countries like.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm guilty of not looking at STEM and education. I mean, this program is a I think, largely a Western phenomenon. I don't know. I mean, I don't read the literature in some other subject areas. But I'm very much conscious that any of these fields are cultural. I mean, some people might suggest, no, science is the same everywhere in the world. But, I would argue that they're different. So my guess is the STEM movements in other cultures would be different, or could be different. I wanted, I'm at a loss for words. Yeah, I've lost my train of thought, so I'll come back to it. Sorry.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I see some real good friends there. I have some concerns. Larry, I really appreciate your passion for what you're talking about and the issue that science certainly.
Here.
I think I heard.
It's just me. We're going to
Yeah, I just want to thank you very much for your conversation, but I'm also concerned about the issue of science, STEM research, the whole idea of STEM being a way of really not creating equity for a number of people. And this is I'm in the field of education myself and the science education, and I'm looking at that seriously because, not to say that science STEM areas are not important, they are, but who are the people that are going to have access? And what are we going to do to make that access available? And that's why, after finishing my PhD here, I started something about mentoring, because I think it's important to allow access to people. And how do you do that best? Is by certainly linking people with people who are already there so that they can get a foot in. And yes, we cannot separate science from society. We cannot separate it from the political issues. The laws that are put out there, especially in Ontario, for example, we know that it's associated with politicians. And again, this is why it's so important that we make science available at high school level, because those are the same people who will become our politicians. They'll be making legislation and policies that are going to affect all of us. And if they don't have that sensitivity to science and technology education, then we are going to be down the wrong road. So I certainly appreciate your passion. I certainly appreciate the direction in which you're looking at it, because we really need to pay attention to access in science and education. There's a body of research talks about people who are minoritized groups who are going to be poorer because they do not have this access. What do we do for those people? How are we addressing that? If we look at the research now and look at those people who have access, many of them don't look like me. Which addresses the very issue you're talking about. So if we're going to really make a difference, we certainly have to talk about the issue of equity. Thank you.
Panelists, do you have any comments?
I mean, I think I said that, I did say that at the very outset, that the STEM movement has actually done a lot of work with trying to bring people of color and more females and other quote-unquote disadvantaged people into those fields. But again, I think that isn't the prime intent. I mean, I don't want to elaborate all that. I did remember my answer to Anna's question, which was that certainly in some parts of the world, as you know, a lot of the products and services that we consume in this part of the world, the so-called advantaged parts of the world, are manufactured in some very poor parts of the world. And many of these people suffer hardships in terms of long hours of labor, poor working conditions, environmental difficulties associated with their work. Their interaction with STEM and STEM education, I'm sure, is much different. They have many more basic needs than we have. We're known for having a greater focus on desires and not so much of a focus on needs. Our needs are largely looked after for most of us. but we're spending most of our time focusing on desires. But in other parts of the world, their focus is much greater extent on needs, and of course, huge benefits of science and technology in those kinds of places in the world. So that's one answer to your question. I'm sorry, so I support what you're saying around equity. It's got to be a movement, but I don't think it's as high in the agenda as wealth concentration at the expense of many.
I just would like to add something. I believe that the example of Brazil is one that approaches this idea of equity by bringing together informal science education with social inclusion through a governmental agency. I think it is a way of thinking about how to integrate perspectives and how to include marginalized groups, but not in this approach of let's bring them scientific and technological knowledge, but let's try to build together knowledge that makes sense for all. So I believe that there are examples in other countries in which the governments have taken interesting positions about such issues such as equality.
Yeah. My own experience with the question our friend has raised, it's two-way. One is the question he has raised can be asked of science itself, can be asked of technology, engineering, mathematics, separately. So whether it's STEM or any of those disciplines, it's an important question that has to be asked. I do my research across continents, including Africa, that we know quite a number of countries there are at the bottom of the scale. So one of the misconceptions or misunderstandings that I encounter and attempt to deal with through the projects that I conduct is that if it is industrialization, it has to come from somewhere. And when you look around, you find a lot of local innovations. So, like STSE, where we talk of the history of science and so on, those are areas that are least addressed in many of these other countries. So it's not a question of STEM. We need to know that STEM can be contextualized, can be localized, and evolution, usually if it's industrialization, it evolves. That's the message for those who've come from beyond the borders of Canada. That is usually my message. Otherwise, that question is relevant to STEM and some of these, what we call gatekeeper disciplines. To remove that, what I usually call it as the bottleneck, we need to educate more masses, and we need to contextualize meanings of these terms. It will still be STEM, but it has to be understood locally to address local problems and even enhance local innovations. Thank you.
Again, I'll keep following up on the point that was raised, specifically within the engineering context in university, and specifically within the design context. There's been a lot of movement to acknowledge, both at the intake side, that we shouldn't just be privileging a particular set of skills. So we're trying to go for broader-based admissions. We're actually trying to look for what we're going to colloquially call interesting people, acknowledging that this now becomes almost groupthink or creation of an internal community. But at least the idea that the gatekeeper of, did you have access to a great science teacher, and did you have access to great science labs, and did you have access to good mathematicians, isn't everything. It's, are you also, did you make interesting things? Have you done and pursued your passions as you've gone forward? So we're trying to acknowledge that we've been too narrow in our gatekeeping towards the science and mathematics. There's also an Engineers Without Borders. I was at their 15-year retrospective reunion. The engineering community, I think, has been forced to realize and grapple with the fact that it was remarkably exclusionary, remarkably decontextualized, used to just drop solutions in what they thought were solutions into areas, didn't pay attention to the values of the individuals. And that our education was also doing that to our own students. We said, you are going to be like this. We held up the engineer and you would become that engineer. And so there's been now a legitimization that all of our students are different, they bring different values, and those values should be welcomed and there should be negotiation between them as opposed to suppression. So it's small and it's starting, but at least through the design area of engineering, little pieces of this are starting to come forward.
Could I just respond to that a little bit?
Please.
I think yes, I think the words are spoken. But when you look at the teachers who make a lot of difference, and there's a large body of research that talks about who students see, that's who they want to be. And that makes a lot of difference. So if you're not seeing them in universities because of what has happened earlier on, and so it's not at this level, but it's the powers that be that makes those decisions. And it's certainly not, as far as I see, and again, contextually, I'm talking about Canada, that we are not seeing those teachers that will have that impact. And that's why I say we need to do something that is certainly more widespread at the levels that they are going to make decisions to become engineers or STEM workers.
Yes, please.
Sorry, I have many questions, but I start with the first one. Actually, coming the political issues around STEM you discussed, I can see that you can tell all of them about any kind of education. So I cannot see that actually your argument could be against education, formal education, or any kind of establishment. So I cannot see actually what is about STEM in this argument, especially coming from an ideology, a country that ideology is very strong. So all argument I can repeat all the argument for that background. So it's what is that core thing about STEM?
Yeah, if I understand your question correctly, yes, I would agree that all subject areas are integrated into politics. Is that?
Oh, actually, all kind of education. Actually,
all kinds of education. It's all integrated into politics. There's no such thing as apolitical education. But why STEM? Because so many products of science and technology, of course, and again, I'm not blaming science and technology. So many products of science and technology in societies with politics and economics and all of those factors that circulate to determine what the society does are causing great harms. How many people are carrying Tim Hortons coffee cups? The automobiles that we have on the roads today, surely they're getting better, but you know that we could have replaced them with electric cars some time ago, and you can go on and on. We have a lot of problems with the products of science and technology that are causing deforestation. I mean, people are using them to cause massive amounts of deforestation, use of huge amounts of corn crops to put high fructose corn syrup into all kinds of manufactured products that are associated with cancer and heart disease. We have many food issues. Heart disease, cancer, and diabetes are huge problems in our society, and this is all related to science and technology. I could go on and on at length. There's endless problems that these fields have created. I'm not saying that it's the field. It's the fields integrated into our societies. And the STEM education is ignoring all that, as far as I'm concerned, and needs to be changed dramatically.
I'm not sure that it's being ignored, Larry. We've seen examples from among the panelists that it's not being ignored. I just want to change the channel slightly and talk about high school, because I think one of the problems we face in high schools particularly is a very, very structured approach to schooling. There's much more flexibility in elementary school and much more flexibility in universities in terms of addressing these issues. But high schools, they're difficult places to work. You know, I was a high science teacher for 17 years, but the structures of high schools are such that there's a ratio of 1 to every 30 students, and there's the subjects are very hard to break down the boundaries. The timetable is very fixed. People are very connected to their particular discipline. It's a very challenging place to work, and the age group is a challenging age group to work with. So I think there's a lot can be done in high schools to break down the boundaries, to integrate the subjects. I'm a big fan of the big ideas notion of curriculum, where you organise the curriculum around a set of big ideas. Big ideas can be local ideas, they can be international ideas. Ideas around poverty, ideas around the health of our cities, around the local wetland, and bringing to bear whatever subjects are required, be they science-related subjects or arts-related subjects or communications-related subjects. I think there's a huge amount that can be done. And I think that I'm not saying that the content is unimportant. I think it is. But it needs to serve the big ideas instead of the big ideas, in a sense, in service of the content. So there needs to be a switch, I think. Kathy, I can see you wanting to say something here.
I do. Okay, I'm glad you said what you said, John, because I actually wrote down a question, and so I'm going to kind of comment a tiny bit on what you said, but really my question is about what is the purpose of STEM, and how would it look in a high school? I don't think it's an issue in elementary schools, like you said. I think teachers know how to integrate all kinds of interesting things. I'm not sure about at the university level, but in high schools, it's the S of STEM that I find very interesting. I do not know of a single high school that even integrates biology, physics, and chemistry. So that in itself is interesting to me because, like, biology and engineering and technology is a very different field than physics and engineering and technology. And even that I can't quite wrap my head around. But here's my question. If we truly are interested, for good reasons, Larry, if we're truly interested in more, like getting kids at the high school, university level to kind of invest in a STEM future in terms of their career and the courses they take, then I'm wondering why the approach isn't to integrate science with areas like literature and visual arts, because that's how we get kids who normally wouldn't be thinking about science to get interested. The kids who like science, the kids who go into engineering, they don't even know what engineering is, but they know they like science. So they're not, I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is to attract those students who don't see themselves as entering that science culture, the whole border crossings idea. Those are the kids that are not in any way serviced by more STEM education. They already don't like science and math. They don't know what engineering is. So to me, that's the question I have, is why STEM? Why not something like science and whatever else, as opposed to, that's my question, is I don't understand the STEM focus as being productive. Sorry for rambling on, but yeah, I had written all this down, so.
There is in the US, at least one of my colleagues is promoting this, a STEAM movement. Science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics.
It's been extended to steamed design into the far end.
Oh yeah. My colleague uses democracy for the D. Steamed.
So now it's a game of just making longer and longer words.
But I mean, I agree with John about the purposes of education being twofold at least. One of which is attract STEM workers, but also, and educate them, but also public literacy. And we're really failing in the public literacy side of things. And that's one of the reasons why we have massive consumption and massive environmental destruction, is public literacy. People are not saying no to many of the products and services that are doing so much damage.
Charlie, what was that notion you were coming up with about political knowledge?
Well, it happens to be the topic of my thesis.
What was the concept you were talking about?
The concept is that the reason teachers are not, teachers in high schools who try to create a curriculum that has a STSE, social justice, SSI kind of focus, even if in their heart they want to do it, they lack what I'm calling political knowledge. And it's kind of what Larry was talking about. They don't understand power structures, more and more people making, fewer and fewer people owning everything and making all the money. It's that funding of science issue. Teachers don't understand that. And it's not because they're just not trained. Science teachers are not trained to think of those big socio-political issues that the political science teachers are trained. So it's the training that's missing. So that's my conclusion, that there needs to be that kind of understanding of those socio-political forces that drive the economy.
Okay, just to
So here, take this away from me. Just keep talking.
not necessarily to follow up, but to invert the question is, why is it so hard to get STEM-trained individuals as teachers? And I think it goes back a little bit to what you're saying. Students may model and find inspiration in the teachers who are there. I look at the graduating class of engineers, and I can tell you that there's unlikely to be any who go into teaching.
But they do later.
To some degree, I'll take your word for it. I haven't looked at the numbers, but to me, there's sort of and I'll admit sometimes when I look at some of the language, I'm like, what did we do wrong? We're nice people, There's this idea that engineers we are responsible for having messed everything up because we made these amplifiers. And the amplifiers only amplify certain signals because we ignored certain ones, and there are some of the bad, right? And yes, it's the idea that there are individuals out there who may choose to use the amplification to, in the same way that you can create great things, you can also deforest vast swaths of the environment. I think I'm trying to figure out, there's an inversion that sometimes I wonder about, and can we get, it's not necessarily how do we get more folks from the non-STEM into STEM, it's how do we get more STEM into the non-STEM? How do we get the folks who I teach into that other realm?
Pay them more.
Okay.
Maybe we'll have, I think maybe one last question here. We have somewhere over here, two last questions.
I really appreciate this discussion on STEM because I think it's very pertinent to potential changes in science education in Canada. And I mean, there seems to be some tension here between this ideal form of STEM and what STEM could be, and perhaps what Larry's saying is how it's being actually practiced and how it's being practiced and implemented in schools. And I guess my question is, when you look at the corporate involvement in STEM education in the USA and how they're actually developing STEM education in the USA, and there are issues involved in that. How in Canada can we do it different? Are we so close to that network, and has STEM already been somewhat defined and constituted by this powerful discourse that's happening in the USA, in particular in their educational system with their next generation science standards, for example, that from certain perspectives can be seen to be quite inaccessible, as Kathy was saying, because they do propagate this very scientific view and perspective that may be inaccessible to a lot of students. They're very extremely structured, and not necessarily providing some of the flexibility that teachers may need to, and local schools may need to make it a community-grounded science education that, has that social justice component in it. You hear here in Canada, in other provinces that are developing STEM, such as Alberta, I've heard from colleagues at the University of Alberta that many of the corporations like Suncor are getting involved in the development of STEM in that province as well. So it becomes concerning about who's developing STEM education, how it's currently being practiced elsewhere, and our location to these powerful networks, you know, and how influential they may be in the development of STEM in Canada. So, yeah, my question is, how can we do it differently in Canada, or has the ship already sailed? And, you know, STEM, as it's been constituted quite powerfully in science education, is already embedded with a discourse that may, you know, heavily influence what happens here in Canada as well. My question is, how can we do it differently? Can we?
Okay,
I'll answer this.
pardon me?
I said, Sam's just going to answer the question.
I know if some of you have looked at some of the writings I do. I appreciate that idea that sometimes teachers have to be prepared to deal with any emergent or pedagogical issues. And one of the phrases I use after some research with the teachers is that often when confronted with a challenge, they tend to teach the way they were taught. If you think about that, then you could see the challenges STEM faces with the teachers who've not been prepared to teach that way. They've been prepared not to include social justice issues because they feel they are covered elsewhere. But in my view, remember, as I said, STEM, if it has to be part of addressing issues or problems that we confront as a society, it has also to deal with how the solutions that are created can impact society. And that's all the training. And therefore, being a teacher educator, to me, I feel I have an obligation when I'm preparing future teachers of STEM and other areas. These are some of the things or the issues we have to bring to our classrooms, to our lectures. There are many, there will be some that will emerge, but it doesn't change adding other acronyms to STEM. Only part of I'm a strong supporter of STEM, but I thought Larry missed something which I thought he was trying to say, that I've also feared about STEM, is that idea of access. If we already have a problem of access to mathematics, science, technology, now when you make that, bring all that and then make it a single discipline, would access increase or it will be curtailed even further? So that has been my fear. Although I see the relationships, but my fear has always been we may have to address this issue. How do we ensure that access will grow as opposed to curtailing it?
Okay, I think we have another question here.
Should I just answer Darren's question? Do you mind? Or? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think there is some hope in this country because our political climate is different. I mean, I'm going to come right out and say our national leader would not support a more holistic and socially just and environmentally sustainable program in STEM education, as far as I'm concerned. So essentially the political right, I believe, wants to do the sorts of things that I'm talking about. But, you know, in this province, we've just elected a Liberal government. There's some hope, and I think at one time there was an NDP government in this province. They did things very differently in the curriculum. You know, other jurisdictions in this country do politics a little differently. I think Quebec, you might find, you know, quite a different orientation towards STEM education and production and consumption and disposal of goods and services. So I think there is some hope in this country, and I would be very interesting to see STEM education implemented in many other countries in the world with very different politics, such as Scandinavian countries.
Do you want to talk about it seems to be a deliberate policy in Brazil.
Yes, I mean, I'm very happy with the results of the elections in Brazil, like John is asking me. And I think that the government is turning into I mean, I think that this idea of social inclusion has been filtering in other areas, and I think that science and technology is just one example, and I think that it reflects in the curriculum development, it reflects in the way literacy is being taught both in schools and the informal sector. So I really think, as Samson said, we really need to contextualize the STEM movement, and we need to contextualize it in local, as he said, but also in terms of countries and the socio-political histories of each country.
So I'm a STEM coach with the TDSB, and this is very new, and I have two of my colleagues here as well. So we've been very interested to hear what you've had to say, because STEM, in regards to the TDSB, and as far as I know, it's the first of its kind in a public school board in Ontario. It's in its infancy, and we're learning a lot, and we're navigating a lot. And it's been really interesting to hear things that we should be aware of, and things that we should perhaps continue to look at or not. But something that I've gotten from you is that partnerships, and this is what I'm seeing from a secondary school level, a lot of my schools are asking for partnerships from outside agencies. And it seems to me that partnerships and equity might not necessarily be equal. So I'm just wondering, is it possible, or is it inevitable? And I guess my question is, because I'm concerned, because I do have schools asking me, well, can we make a partnership with this bank? Can we make a partnership with this university? You know, and then I'm worried that these outside partnerships will come in and they will change the focus of what STEM is.
I'm going to hope you allow us to keep working with Roberta Tevlin at Danforth Tech. I've had design teams for the last 2 years looking at bringing making into grade 11 physics. And one of the nice things about design is that we actually say to them, you have to engage with stakeholders. And so they've talked, Steve Bibla and Lisa Blake and Roberta, and they're about to go pilot a few more times. And this is in part because our students realized that we had no idea what was going on in the high school, and we wanted to bring some of what we knew there. But at the same time, and it was actually quite interesting, this is what 3D printing. So the real thing was, can we put 3D printing in grade 11 physics? And my engineering students thought this would be great, and they enjoyed it, and they've been learning what it's like to teach, and going to your point, they may actually be some of the ones who go into teaching immediately instead of the lag. And to the point of access, what was fascinating is, at U of T engineering, we don't have 3D printers that are readily available. We had to use the public library. But now there's making happening in Toronto public libraries. So we suggested to Roberta at Danforth Tech, you can partner with Toronto public libraries to get your stuff printed. We'll help you with the software, and we'll have this great nexus. So I hope it all works. Are we asking our students when they're looking at designing propellers to think of social justice issues? Honestly, no. But we are getting them to start to ask questions about competition versus collaboration, about innovation versus just following the status quo. So at least starting to get some questions that weren't being asked raised through the medium of design and making. So it's I don't know if this at all addresses your question, but we're happy to keep playing because we'd like to know more.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well,
Can I just put in a plug before you're in the wrap-up phase? I can tell. The journal that comes out of the Centre for Science, Math and Technology Education is sponsoring a special issue on STEM, and we're in a kind of call for papers phase at the moment. So if you, in your work, are interested in developing some of your ideas into a paper to submit to the special issue, you would be we welcome to receive your submissions.
Sorry, what's the name of the paper, the journal? What's the name of the journal?
The journal is called the Canadian Journal for Science, Mathematics and Technology Education.
and you can learn more about it on the 11th floor. I guess we have you can come and visit and
Yeah.
So thank you, panelists, for a terrific, thought-provoking discussion, very interesting perspectives and ideas, and I really enjoyed it. Please join me in thanking our group. Please also join me in thanking Cheryl Clark, who at the back, who organized all of the setup. So thank you for coming tonight, and if you'd like to talk to some of our panelists, they can probably stick around for a few minutes.
Our next forum, by the way, is on social media and education. It's going to be held probably in February. So if you're interested in impact of social media on the classroom, particularly on the classroom, the merits and the drawbacks of social media, then come watch out for the notice and come along in February. Thanks very much.
Thank you.